Well, thank you for joining us today. As we gather today, we're all on Indigenous lands. For those of you joining us from home, I encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous presence in your area, both past and present. Those of us at the Museum of the White Mountains are on Indakina, which is the ancestral and present homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples. We're grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waterways. Personally, I'm grateful to the Abenaki and Wabanaki elders who took time to think with me about our summer exhibition. I greatly benefited from our conversations. And I'm thrilled today to have you all join me in learning from some of the contributors to the exhibition. Bill and Sheri Gould are citizens of the Nulhegan band of the Abenaki and live in Warner, New Hampshire. They were both born and raised in New Hampshire, and they celebrate their Abenaki heritage and love of making beautiful baskets. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Sheri. For those of you, I'm going to just show you on the camera for a second, Bill, and then we'll come back to you as well later. So just so that folks at home can see what we have going on here. Bill is working on a basket here while Sheri's gonna talk with us. So we'll come back to that. Sorry for the wiggly camera. All right, there we go. Oh, I'm just gonna get my phone out of the way, and without further ado, and hopefully with no technological challenges, thank you, Sheri.
Okay, hi everybody. And thank you everybody for joining us in person today. So yeah, we're going to just ignore, for you, those of you on Zoom, you don't get to see this, but all the little chatty things and are on the share screen here in the house. So I'm very happy to be here today. I'll start with Kauai and Dilwazi Sali Gould, Indai Manadnak and Wikiyak Massasecum, Nodzia Baz Nodaka. And so in our Avenatti language, I just said, hello, my name is Sheri Gould. I was born in Peterborough, Monadnock. And I live just a little ways away from Lake Massasecum in a small section of Warner, New Hampshire. And I'm a professional basket maker. So today we're going to talk about Abenaki baskets. Oh yeah, whoops. Okay, so this is part of a longer lecture where I go into a lot more detail about the role of women in Abenaki culture in keeping the culture alive through basket making. There was an incredible industry of basket making that happened from Odanak. It built the village, which was incredible. The income that the Abenaki were bringing into their village in 1932 was about $250,000 a year, which was a lot of money for a few ragtag Indians to be making. The government became aware of it and quickly seized it, the business, like got their agents in control of it, and immigration wasn't allowed so much, or crossing the border became harder to sell the baskets. And as the government took over the business, it became much less lucrative for people, but people continued to do it because it was so much a part of our culture. So we're going to talk about the fancy basket industries of Odanak, and then the utilitarian baskets that makers in Indakina. So we'll see more about that later. And then modern day tradition bearers of Abenaki fancy baskets and utilitarian basket making in New Hampshire and Vermont, really in Indakina. So Indakina is what we call our homeland. Excuse me. And it encompasses all of New Hampshire, most of Vermont, except the little tiny southwestern corner. Massachusetts, there's like different stories emerging now, but we always say from Route 2 north, so the northern part of Massachusetts, and southern Quebec, the St. Lawrence River down. And we call that Indakina, and even a little into Maine, or sometimes some people say all of Maine, but the Maine tribes, you know, really have formed so solid their own identity now that I just stick with the part that the Western Abenaki inhabited. So basket making did become a way for survival after contact and the resulting diaspora in New England, diaspora in New England, potato, potato. And Abenaki women did play an incredibly instrumental role in making that happen. It created the wealth that I talked about. Many tribes sold baskets, but Abenaki baskets by far were were the most sought after and valued. And part of that, part of it was the women and the work they did and the working together as families coming down to the, move on. Well, I can show that a little later, to the tourist spots. But in terms of talking about the seasons, it was very seasonal, this work. So in the winter months, the men would go off hunting, guiding, leading hunts as guides. And so here we have two pictures of Odanak men, Louis Tahamont, and we're going to talk about the Watso family that settled in Newbury, New Hampshire. And Catherine, who married Louis Watso, this is her uncle. She was a Tahamont. And then Elie Robert worked as a hunting guide as well. So fishing, hunting, canoeing, those were the kinds of activities the men tended to do in the winter, as well as getting the brown ash trees cut and doing the heavy pounding. So among our people, we always had equal but separate roles. So the men did certain tasks and the women did certain tasks. Neither was more important than the other. And then the women were busy weaving baskets while the men were away. There was no time to drag them through with so much to do. And braiding the sweetgrass. Did I say that? Yeah. And so this was like, these pictures are all about Odanak and the fancy basket trade that happened there. We're going to talk a little bit later about the utilitarian basket trade and what people like the Nulhegan Abenaki were doing down here in the States during that time. So this shows a little bit of the tourist kinds of things that you would see. There were Intervale, Bethlehem, Echo Lake. And this picture in the lower, I'm dyslexic, the lower right-hand corner of the screen, I am 97% sure is Louis and Catherine Watso. His mustache is pretty distinctive. I've done the genealogy of the family. The year this was taken, they were registering the births or deaths of children in that locality. So I'm quite sure that's him. Catherine, it's a little harder to tell in that picture for sure that that's her, but we're pretty sure that's who that is. So here are Catherine and Louis in Newbury. So in 1895. So what happened was, well, later on you'll see Steve Lugo, who became an apprentice to Bill. My husband Bill's here weaving his basket. And Stephen is the great-grandson of Louis and Catherine Watso. And his mother would come with him we used to run a language camp, basket language camp at our place. And they are still in Claremont, New Hampshire. So Louis and Catherine came to Newbury. They lived on the lake. They were very well accepted there. They would put their regalia on. They had a little teepee for the kids and postcards. But really, Louis, and in the census, Louis is listed as the basket maker and Catherine as the housewife, which is your typical, right, Euro way that people get listed. But in reality, Catherine was making the baskets. Louis was a fireman. He was buying and selling cottages on the lake. He was very well accepted in the community, as was Catherine. And he would also take the baskets around the lake, like Sunapee, and sell them to the tourists. And so they were there for quite a few years, but we can't really see, and I can't move it, so I'll mess it up. They were in Woodstock in 1895, Newbury, I think it was around 1890. And, oh, you can see it on your phone.
1907.
Thank you. And Claremont in
1920.
Hey, yay, we don't need technology. We can coordinate person to person. How amazing. And so, yes, they did eventually settle in Claremont, but they kept a summer place on the lake. And Steve remembers even as a child going there. They did not, so the reason they left Odanak and decided to come to New Hampshire was because of the Indian boarding schools. So they had 3 daughters. When the oldest daughter was taken by the Canadian government and put in the Indian boarding school, she came home at the end of the year and she begged, please, please, please don't ever make me go there again. And she was at Carlisle, which is one of the better schools, but they were what they were. And so the family moved here. So New Hampshire, in a way, was a refuge in that sense for reservation Indians or Indians on a reserve to be able to get some relief from the boarding school nightmare. And so they did, they would do the regalia, they would do some things for the tourists, but they didn't want the girls to learn the language, and they didn't want them to be baskets. They really wanted them to be safe, and it still was not safe around the turn of the 19th century to be Abenaki in New England. So now we'll talk a little bit about the Abenaki rural basket makers, or these are all examples of Nulhegan basket makers. And so we see here, they were not tied to the reserve at Odanak. There were Dyer, Blake, and Phillips families, and the Sweetser family of basket makers. So all of those families appear in the eugenics records of Vermont. And I'm a descendant. This is Eber Dyer, who's my great-great-grandfather. And you see Newt Washburn holding one of his baskets there. The Sweetser family married in with the Phillips families. The Blake and Dyers were intermarrying together, and also marrying with the Phillips families. So all of these family bands and the descendants of all of them are a large part of what comprises the Nulhegan band of Abenaki today. And the Nulhegan band, the Phillips family are also tied to the Phillips Grant, which is all Coast County in New Hampshire. It goes from Lake Umbagog to Lake, I would say it's right, Memphregog.
Memphregog?
Yeah. Or Magog, if in Quebec, I can say that much better. So that is our traditional homeland in that area. And through the Vermont state recognition process, Nulhegan was tied to that grant. Of course, for Vermont, it meant a very little corner of it, but for New Hampshire, it means all of Coast County and into a little bit of Maine as the traditional homeland. But of course, the diaspora meant that our families traveled around, and we'll see a little bit here. The basket at the bottom of this image, I love. So it is in part of the Vermont Historical Society collection, and there's a provenance with it. It tells that the families that were known as gypsies, and we're going to see a little more about that in the next slide, traded it to one of the farm families in Vermont for hay, for the horses. And that family, it was in the family for 3 generations, and then they donated it to the Vermont Historical Society with that provenance. So who are these gypsy families? This is from the eugenics records in Vermont. And is there anyone who doesn't know what eugenics project was all about in Vermont? About breeding better Vermonters. It was about identifying what was considered imbeciles and defective genes, and doing sterilization. And they claimed it was, people agreed to the sterilization, they did not. If you were identified and you were on the list and you went to have your appendix out, you were sterilized and you didn't know it. And Vermont kept really extensive records. That doesn't mean New Hampshire didn't participate in this, they did. And as a professional genealogist, I was hired to do some work for BBC on one of those who do you think you are kind of genealogical ancestry shows. And I was tracking this woman's life and got into some court records in Laconia and started to see these little symbols. And I was like, oh my God, this is eugenics, I know. But I had to call the Franklin Pierce Law Library to get confirmation that it was a young woman who had been sterilized in order to marry. Yeah. So anyway, here we have in the eugenics records in Vermont, the second line down under the squiggly line there says, the authorities of Vermont, they know as Old Pete, king of the gypsies. And it goes on to talk about the family in not necessarily favorable ways. It's pretty disheartening to look at them. And then in our own family history, a cousin had this letter at the top from her grandmother about her in-laws. So that was my great-great-grandfather Eber Dyer that you saw the picture of before. His brother Simon was Valerie's great-grandfather. And so her grandmother wrote this letter about them saying they traveled like Indians and begged. Your grandfather Frank Dyer and dad's name was Simon Dyer. And it's a long 2-page letter that gives a lot more information, but that's the gypsy identity part. And then to the right hand of the screen, you'll see where there's an oral history from Fred Tuttle. And if nobody knows who Fred Tuttle is, what an amazing man. So Fred Tuttle was an old farmer in Vermont, an old farm family member in Vermont. And I love this. I'm running for state rep in New Hampshire, so I love it even more. Fred's story that a man from away came and he was going to be elected as, I don't know what office, senator or something. And the locals didn't like it one bit. And he had a lot of money behind him. And so they got Fred to run against him, and Fred won. And then he turned the position over to somebody, a politician who was capable of doing the job. But that's the kind of character is. And if you Google on YouTube, you find some really great videos of Fred Tuttle. Well, the Dyer family and the Blake families would go to his parents' farm near Tunbridge, and they would go in the woods and pound the ash and make their baskets. And they would also husk the corn, get paid to husk the corn, and then they'd braid the corn husks and make them into mats and go around and sell them to the farmers. So we have a lengthy, there is a recording, but this is part of the transcription of the interview with Fred, where he's confirming that, yes, they knew that they were Indians, but he's also talking about, and they would go to the Tunbridge Fair and trade with the gypsies. There were gypsies, you know, he said, in those days. And then at the bottom, and it's cut off a little bit here, but this was, so part of the eugenics project was writing to agencies, even in other states, and collecting information. When Nancy Gallagher first published her book, Breeding Better Vermonters, and I first read it, I worked for New Hampshire DCYF, and I worked at the state office, and my job was interpreting social work practice to the IT people, computer people. And I was responsible for the data quality of the records we kept and for generating all the reports. And so I was going to go to the Vermont Sheep and Wool Festival. Bill and I raise sheep and spin wool and do that too. And so they had just come to me, my boss had come to me and he said, you know, we're having trouble with how we connect families in the database. And, you know, the whole configuration of families is changing so much. We need better ways to do that. And you work with the genealogy databases all the time. We need you to help us with that. And so I'm like, okay, I'll think about that. I go to the Sheep and Wool Festival. Nancy Gallagher's there. She has the book Reading Better Vermonters. I buy it. She autographs it. I read it. I went back to work. I'm like, no way, Jose. I'm not helping you do anything. It was the most amazing breakdown of any boundaries across all, whether it was police or child welfare or it's just across all, there was no confidentiality. They were just sharing information willy-nilly and writing up these just hateful, horrible, horrible things. And so anyway, this is a letter from the Agency for Dependent Children in New York regarding Paul Phillips, the brother of Matilda, and Matilda was a major informant, but it just meant she talked to Harriet Abbott, the social worker they hired to write all this stuff up. And he was known as Gypsy Phillips and lived in the vicinity of Hudson Falls for a while. On the left-hand side, you see the little newspaper clipping that a band of gypsies passed through the town on Tuesday. It consisted of 3 families, a team to each family, and encamped on the road to the lower village just below John Tewksbury's for the night. And they started from New York and had traveled through Vermont and were on their way to cities below. They sell baskets of their own manufacture. And this was in the Kearsarge Independent in 1884. And they're talking about Warren, which is the town I live in. So you can imagine how thrilled I was when our historical society found that form. But they were known in many, many towns. So while historians say that all Indians were gone from New Hampshire by 1725, Basketmakers provide a trail of survival. Jeannie Brink of Berry, Vermont was one of the women one of my 2 mentors. I was very privileged to have 2 years to apprentice under Jeannie making the fancy baskets. And Jeannie is a descendant of the Abunaki family. The camp in the middle picture is her family's camp at Thompson Point in Vermont on Lake Champlain. And Jeannie, like the Watso family, very much like the Watso family, her mother and her grandparents did not want her to know the language or make the baskets because they didn't want her to be identified as Indian and be in danger. But Jeannie did have an opportunity to work with Sophie Millette from Odenak and learn the basket making. And then she devoted her life to training apprentices. And I'm very, very fortunate that I was one of those apprentices. And then the picture on the left is my granddaughter Millie making her first basket. So this is a fun little project, and this is kind of new in this lecture that I wanted to share with you. Many of you may know that Dr. Bob Goodby wrote a book recently called The Deep Presence, and he wrote about his findings of 13,000 years of existence of Abenaki here in New Hampshire. And so Dr. Goodby decided he wants to create this series of posters for schools out of the book. And so the picture in the center is me with a young woman reading, and that's from a photograph in the book. But he got Miranda Nulhegan, an incredibly talented artist who is a teacher at King's, in the King School District, the middle school, which is where they found that old site that he writes about in his book. And so Miranda was creating this portrait of basket making. And so it's me there, and then to the side, you see a log, and so that's what it looks like when you're pounding the brown ash and the splints are coming up. There's a birch bark basket on top of the log, and that would have been what our people traditionally used. We didn't need these fancy baskets like pre-contact. That was really another form of, that was, you know, an economic form of survival for our people after contact. There's a vase that I like to do the basket vases over a glass vase. There's Catherine in her, Catherine Lutzow in her regalia, and then the bottom of one of Bill's baskets, because we didn't have the Washburn family's permission, but it's a neat style basket. And then in the upper left corner is the Sadicus family, or Massaticus family. They settled in Keene, and I believe her name is Mary, the wife and mother is the sister of Louis Watson. So she was a Watson. And as we're doing all of this, and I'm thinking about Steve Luco apprenticing with Bill, and I'm thinking about Bill and Newt Washburn, and then I'm doing an extensive study of those Nulhegan families that were part of the diaspora at the contact period, which was so late in Coos County, that the Phillips family was marrying in with the Sweetser family. And as all these pieces came together, I said, you know, this is really like a tale of the connections of our families and how we're all connected. And so we've talked about maybe doing like a bigger mural up in Bethlehem, like wouldn't that be so cool? But anyway, we're very excited. This poster series will come out soon, and they'll be free to the schools for 1 year. So watch for that. So here's some of the contemporary basket makers, and up in the top left-hand side are the Bolds, Valerie Bowles and her two daughters at our basket language camp. They continue to make baskets to this day, and it was their family that got those little snippets that I shared with Fred Tuttle and their grandmother. So they're part of the Dyer and Blake families. And beside that is Carrie Woods, who's a cousin of Jean Brinks, and below her is her son Aaron Wood, pounding on a mash log. And so they apprenticed under Jean Brink and learned basket making conducive to their family, but they're also expanding into the utilitarian. And then in the lower left is Bill with Steve Luco, the great grandson of Louis and Catherine. And then I had to include the knitting basket. So there's a knitting basket up in the show. And for anyone who watched the Cheryl Savageau do her poems, she did that great poem about her grandmother knitting. And she's like, well, you know, we adapt and make things. And I got so excited because as I shared the other night through the Zoom with Cheryl, years ago, I was at a conference and I hadn't learned basket making yet. And I've always been very crafty, and so I spin yarn and I knit and I do a lot of colonial, what I called colonial crafts, right? And so we do this project, Avenatti Trails now, where we're really identifying how you really can't separate things out here. We've all lived together for so long and we've intermarried But anyway, so Cheryl's saying, you know, as Abenaki people, we adapt things like knitting patterns. And then at this conference, what I said to this young Navajo guy who had his table all set up, and he said, "What do you do?" I said, "I do colonial crafts." He goes, "What do you do?" I said, "I weave, I spin yarn and knit." And he said, "Tell my grandma that spinning yarn is not a Native American craft, a Navajo woman." And I burst out laughing and thought, really, this is silly. And then I went to Odanak and I saw this knitting basket for the first time. And of course, I was so excited. Oh my God, it is tradition for Abenaki. And then you think, no, they just made it for the tourist trade. They weren't knitting, though they were knitting. When I read some of the captive stories, I've studied all the captive stories to glean what I can about that the captives were saying at that early time of contact about the Avenatti, scrape the colonialism off it. But at any rate, one of the women was bemoaning that they made me knit socks for them. That's what they made me do. I said, see how people loved the knitting. They wanted knitting socks. You sit there and keep busy knitting socks. So I don't think the knitting basket was only for the tourists. But I hated those big rings. And they called them elephant ears. And I'm like, I'm sorry, that's ugly. Like, why do they have those big rings? I tried to be polite, but I thought it looked so ugly. And Rodrigo Brinkhorst, who was the Megan of the Odanak Museum at the time, said to me, wow, that's because the train went right through Pierreville, which is the town adjacent to Odanak. And people would be riding the train back and forth to Montreal or to Quebec all the time. And he said, you can imagine if you're knitting and you have a ball of yarn and you're on the train, or even if you have a basket and you're on the train, but it's going to topple around and it's going to be flying all over. He said, so the women put their arms through those loops and the basket stayed steady. And so after that, I had to go to the Department of Motor Vehicle and register or get my license, whatever, stand in the long line forever. And I brought my knitting basket and I started. So this presentation hopefully has helped you understand how traditional values, philosophies, history, and other aspects of culture are transmitted through basketmaking. And I'll take any questions. Yes.
Well, you mentioned Mr. Tuttle. If I'm not mistaken, he was an elected official.
He did win the election, but he turned the office over. It was a senator, I think, or something. And some fellow had come up from New York, and he was being backed and going to win. And the locals didn't like that. So Fred ran, he won. But there was another Vermonter that would be more capable. He didn't see himself as somebody. Now, he could have run for something else that I don't know outside of that.
I know his grandson got a degree in anthropology from Brown University.
Aha.
So that's just a small question. Here's an ethnographic question. Where do you differentiate Anacook from Abenaki? How linguistically or territorially or?
That's an excellent question. So it's a much longer lecture. It's a big part of what I've been working on with my current research is trying to trace the whole diaspora, which is why I'm learning not to say diaspora, but say diaspora. So what is the identity? Okay, I grew up knowing I was Indian. My parents, you're Indian. My mother was told, you're Indian, don't ever tell anybody, don't tell anybody, you're Indian. So as you get older, people are like, what tribe? I don't know. And what do you have as a child in New Hampshire to go by? You have, I was born in 1955, so you have Hollywood, right? So I'm trying to picture my grandmother in a teepee and buffaloes somewhere in New Hampshire. And it just, yeah, it wasn't working. So it was like, I don't know. And then I went to work in child welfare. I was a professional and I traveled around the country and I had the opportunity to spend time with a lot of the tribes across the country. And I was too naive then to know about all the wannabes and the insulting ways people affronted tribal people. But I would, of course, be gravitated to tribal people and I would ask them questions and they would give me answers. And finally, one woman, Jackie, who was Cree, and we were at Boys Town learning behavioral stuff that Boys Town teaches. And Jackie and I spent a lot of time together. And finally, she said to me, you know, my tribe would tell me not to tell you any of these things or answer your questions. And so I learned that it was pretty disrespectful what I was doing or the way I was going about it. If you didn't But at any rate, she said, but I sense you are not being disrespectful. You are very sincere. And so I heard a lot of different things, but I kept thinking, but these aren't my people. And I was very careful. I didn't want to just learn somebody else's traditions. And as a genealogist, of course, I kept searching, and was so fortunate to have cousins like Valerie, and then another cousin in Massachusetts who the Blakes that originally crossed over from Canada had stayed there and intermarried. Anyway, so I learned who my people were and what my roots were. And that, you know, how strong that identity has stayed all down through the years. We had just had documentation all the way through that they identified as Native people, as Indian. But then it was 2000 for the census. I ran a shelter for girls. That was before I worked for the state. And so we're talking about the census, and somebody said, well, you say you're Native American, you need to put that on the census. And I said, no, I refuse to answer race. You don't have to by law. And they said, no, we need to count Native Americans. What are you? Are you Abenaki? I go, I've never heard that. So growing up in southern New Hampshire, you didn't see Abenaki in any history book. You saw Pennacook. It was the Pennacook people who lived here. And then you'd see all these other crazy lists, and none of them matched up in Nulhegan and Nashua, and I can go on, right? And as I got older and as a genealogist, I'm like, I'm going to get my head around this. I'm a little dyslexic, but I can do this. And I try to study these lists, and none of them matched up, and it changed over time. And who the hell are the Tarantines that are going down in the deck? And this one, and what are these red and pink people? What? All of a sudden, one year they killed them. And then I met Bob Goodby, and I just loved listening to Bob. And he knew I didn't really buy that whole red paint thing. And shortly thereafter, they discovered that. He doesn't lecture about red paint anymore either. So I finally have just really studied it. So how do we learn the keys to these things? One of the great ways is through our language. So in the Abenaki language, what is the word for tribe? It's family. How did the Abenaki people survive? As family bands. And so that was what was going on with the Pennacook, which was really so all of these tribal names, no matter what I've just said, they're place names. Pennacook was a place. It was centered in Concord, and the people that lived there traveled to, up and down the Merrimack River. So, but then, when you get down near the Massachusetts border, it's the Nashua, but that's a place. And so people would say, Europeans came over. We did this Abenaki Trails project, and we were like, okay, we're going to study in Hopkinton. What was the history? Well, we had two village sites. One was down in this corner, one was up in this corner. Oh, this one, pretty soon we're bleeding right over into Henniker. And this one we're bleeding right up into Warner. And it's like, Abenaki people didn't draw squares on a map and live in them. They lived on the land where it made sense. And so we realized, and then when we got to 4 towns, we were like, okay, scope creep, we can only handle so much. And so now we're doing it kind of 2 towns at a time, adding to those original 4. But the point being that when the colonists who came here with the square box mindset, who are you? Where do you live? Who's your kin? Abenaki people didn't live that way. They didn't think that way. And so who are you? I'm people, Almovar. And how many tribes are changing from Navajo to Dene? It means the people. And I'm not going to say the Mohawk, but there's their word for people they're changing to. Can anybody here say it? Thank you, Haudenosaunee. And so, ours is Almovar. That's what we would be if we called ourselves the people. In fact, Odin is the Abenaki word for village. Where do you live? Odanak. A-K-E-K is a locative. It means at the place of. So Kentucky comes from Pagantukuk, which is at the place of the nut tree. So these tribal names were really primarily place names, and it was groups of family bands that lived. And why did the colonists have such a hard time mastering and getting a handle on them? Why are there so few records for the Abenaki people? Because they were small family bands. They were able to be really nimble. They were really about local control. They consolidated under Pas Conway or other great leaders when they needed to for purposes, but they weren't really, he wasn't a king. It wasn't a boxed kingdom. So as the colonists came up and people are trying to survive and they're trying to move all around, and Gordon Day did a really great look at the identity of the St. Francis, where he's looking at all that who were these people? Where were they? Marge Bruchac did a really great paper on Shattuck, which was a Mohegan place in New York, and Andros had offered that to like the southern tribes out of Massachusetts and maybe some southern, and some Penfield went there too. And then eventually, have I said enough? Like I can keep going with this, but there is no easy answer to this. The simple thing that I say is the Pennacook were down here around Concord, this place in. Eventually, a lot of them wound up at Avenatti. Eventually, a lot of Indian people who were in Canada kind of came back down, either, as we showed in this lecture, either from the reserve or from the Métis population. And so I say Pennacook, the Abenaki term backwalk onto, and it took a very long time before I would say, okay, I'm not. Because I want proof. I don't claim something I don't have, I'm not entitled to prove. But today I say I'm not. So my people are, that's what they all were. They were called gypsies. I've traced I have a couple of little, my friend Emily says speed bumps, not brick walls. They're not Romanov. There's no Romanov blood in our family. Gypsy was another term that got applied by colonial people to people that traveled around. My branch didn't drink and steal.
So we have a question from the Zoom from Deanne, and I wonder if this might be a good moment to turn the camera on Bill for a second.
Cool.
So the question is about, do you process your own ash splits? And I thought that,
and Bill can best answer that.
Well, that was my sense. Let's see. Hold on, I'll zoom. I didn't bring the remote over with me. All right. Oh, wrong way. Sorry if everyone on Zoom that this has become like a exercise in.
Enjoy the ride.
Exactly. Exactly. All right, there we go. Okay, Bill. Want to talk to us about splints?
So splints, yes, I do process my own ash splints. We cut the ash trees, the brown ash, which Megan and her family gave us a few weeks ago to cut. And then you bring them, you take the back. I keep them about 8 feet long, which seems to be work with me. You take the back off, and then you just take a hammer and you pound the length of the water. And that loosens up each year's growth rate. So picture the end of the log, and you have the growth rings. Yeah, there are some are thicker, some are thinner, depends how good a year it was. But hammering them separates the growth rates. So, and from there, depending on what you're going to take for a basket, I make these gauges, which you take one of the strips of growth rings, which I make about 1.5 inches long. I just lay them out on the board if I want 1/4 inch splints or 3/8 inch splints. I just run these knives or gauges along. That's what gives me the splint I want. You shave them with a knife, which is like running a board through a planer. Do that.
And then we had another question, another sort of other process questions in the chat that I thought I'd read out, and then we can go to some in-person questions. So Deanne also asked, do you put oil on your baskets or any kind of finish?
I don't. Nothing.
No.
And then what do you use to dye the baskets? Like, do you dye the colored pieces in the fancy baskets?
I do, and I really wanted to do the natural dyes. I'm all about organics and natural and all that. And tried to find. Well, what happened was, as that fancy basket business developed and grew, and Abenaki people were modern people. and chemical dyes came along. Well, you could spend a lot of time trying to go out and gather plants and do that, or you could get this cheap chemical dye, and that's what they did. And there is no surviving recipes that we've been able to find of the Abenaki from Odenak on the natural dyes. I've learned a lot about natural dyes in terms of wool, just in general. And I played some. A dear friend, Lorraine Carey, was an incredible dyer and dyed wool. And she and I did this whole program through the New Hampshire Arts Council where I was teaching her basket making, and then she was going to teach me the natural dyeing. We were going to continue the experiments on what works with wool and also on wood. And unfortunately, we lost her. So I have all her materials. We keep talking about studying it and getting better at it. In the meantime, I use chemical dye. There was one child that, one man at Odenak who talked about when he was a little kid, he thought everybody's mothers had blue fingers or colored fingers because they never wore gloves when they dyed their basket material. Yes.
I was curious about color too, and some of the combinations and like season wise, like are there colors that you personally use each season to like as far as what's growing or what the colors were?
So mostly when I do natural dyes, the latest exciting one I learned a couple of years ago was birch leaves make this incredible lemon yellow. So prior to that, I was using marigold or onion skins, either one of those. Not marigold. I'm trying to say that yellow. People think it's what makes them sneeze. Ragwood really makes them sneeze. Thank you, goldenrod. And in Avenatti, the word for goldenrod is the same word as for yellow pond lily. And I was like, no, that's an important dye. It should be a separate word. And they would say, go get the goldenrod to dye the splint, and people would know which yellow flower it was. Go get the yellow flower to make medicine, and you'd know which flower. Anyway, fun stuff about the language. But those are not a bright lemon yellow. And I was watching Arnie and Carlos, some Norwegian knitters that are a stitch if you haven't seen them. Oh, that's a little pun. But anyway, they were talking, listen, their video from them, I got to another Norwegian woman, I guess it was, that was talking about dyeing with birch leaves. And Bill's a logger and into the forest stuff. So I'm like, are there different birch trees? And so we played with it and tried it. And oh my God, I made it incredible yellow. For me, the seasonal thing comes more about like, it's like whatever colors I have or I'm inspired to use, but I have a sense of this is a fall palette or this is a spring palette, but not so much the seasons. And even with Lorraine stuff, a lot of the dye materials you dry, and so then you have them. So the seasonal part would be you gather in the summer. Same with sweetgrass, but the wood you can cut any time of the year. In the winter, if you're pulling it out by hand, it's a little easier on the snow. And then you do a lot of the weaving stuff in winter. So the seasonality that way, but good question.
Yeah, you had a slide on the so-called Indian camps.
Yeah.
And then there were some lists. So this was a late 19th century phenomenon where groups of people, families would travel around and set up a so-called camp.
Yeah.
For the tourists.
Yep. And different families had different locations. And it's interesting, when I do that longer, you would love this, that longer lecture on strictly women and in the economy of doing all of this. So I don't have the note to give you, but if you take my contact information and you email me and ask me the question, there was a woman who did an incredible research on Native American basket trade and across cultural border sort of stuff. And she looked at everybody except the Abenaki at Odenak, which was really interesting to me. But at any rate, and so, what was your question? Oh yeah. So, and she tells in there how, each family had a place they would go to for the summer trade, and the kind of money they made. One of the things that was really interesting, now this is different than Louis and Catherine's experience in Newbury, but in general, in the big tourist areas, the women had a lot more freedom to interact with the tourists. And so the men would have to play a much more backseat role. And that was really, really an interesting phenomenon, that in general, Native women were less threatening in that time period, in the Victorian time period, than Native men were in terms of tourism. But the thing I love for the Odanak people that I learned is that there's another article in the Canadian magazine about, in 1925, I cited some of that information, the amount of money they were making. And that gives some details too about how Odanak families, where some of the different families were going. They'd go to Chicago, New Jersey, a lot of different places, not just ours. And some of the places in New Hampshire, it could well have been Penobscot people coming down too. But most of it seems to be Abenaki from Odanak.
I noticed that one of the places was Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And in that period, Bethlehem had more hotels per
Yes.
square inch
Yeah.
than it had residents.
Right, the fresh air. Yeah.
Right, so that would, when they would have grown by all those hotels.
Yeah, yeah. And then there's also some discussion, and this gets back to that diaspora talk of the families were going back to the places that their families originally came from. And there's just so little recorded about that. It's hard to nail that down, but there does seem to be some indication that that families were going, in some cases, were going back to the origin of what they're doing.
What's your preferred wood?
Excuse me?
What's your preferred wood?
So brown ash and black ash. So we call it brown ash, it's black ash, it's the same thing. And of course, this talk didn't even get into what the ash borer is doing, which is why Bill was so thankful when Megan's father had some of that on his land in Dummer. And Bill got to bring his apprentice Daryl, and they had great fun telling everybody that Dumb and Dumber went to Dumber. We were very happy with that. So that was the last time Bill's come up in '93. We don't leave the farm a lot. And when they came up to do that, which was what, 3 weeks ago?
Yeah.
All the trees were like de-leafed from a different pest, right? What do they call it now? The woolly caterpillar?
Or the spongy moth.
The spongy moth, that's what they call it. Yeah. It's the spongy moth, which is really what we always knew as a gypsy moth. Oh my God, gypsies.
Right.
Here we go. We're talking in circles here. But at any rate, the leaves are going back. Bill was very happy to see that. At any rate, the ash borer has killed them all in southern New Hampshire. You cannot go anywhere and find ash trees healthy enough. Now, I did hear from a student in Andover at the academy there. Thank you. I have a trunk line, and so I have some money issues. So he's great for what he does when the basket's on. I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay.
But he's also great for filling in the words I can't think of. The Proctor Academy, that a student was studying the ash borer, and he found out that she found out that they have a stand there in Andover that's not being impacted by the ash borer, and so they're doing a fascinating study on what is it? Is it chemicals in the soil that are impacting it? What's happening? And we're doing a lot of preservation work with William Davidson, who Megan's contacted. And so in parts of the state where the emerald ash borer is, which is most of the state south of the mountains, so from here south, he's inoculating trees that meet certain conditions. And so the state is earmarked to do 10 plots in each county and to try to preserve a parent generation. But when we first contacted him, he didn't even have brown ash versus white ash on his radar. So now he's focusing on brown ash and making sure that he's looking at.
What's the problem about the ash?
So the emerald ash borer is a new pest, an invasive pest, and it's killing all the ash trees. Oh,
What do you like about the ash?
why do we like that? Yeah. So brown ash, our creation story is that we were created from the brown ash tree. So originally created this from stones, and but the people were so hard-hearted, and they would stomp around. And so he's like, nah, this isn't working. So he crumbled the stones up. I'm not a good storyteller. He crumbled the stones up, and that's the little people that we see. And you rarely see them. They're very elusive, but we have little people in our culture, and they came from the stones. So then he looked around and he saw the ash tree, and it was so supple and flowing. And so he would take his arrows, and every place he would hit in the tree, a human stepped forward. And so our very creation comes from it. And our people always used ash. And so for the snowshoes, and which we designed, and eventually they were used against us. But that's the stories we hear. Did you do that? Yeah. I saw that. That was so great. I hadn't seen it before. But in our Abenaki Trails work, we're seeing where they were sharing the snowshoes. So there was another whole aspect back then that kept below the radar and didn't make this records that survived, the stories that survived, a collaboration. But anyway, so we knew the suppleness of it. What I suppose is that once the colonists came, once this diaspora had destroyed the economies and the means of living, and Native people needed new ways of survival, that the basket industry became a way of selling. They could see these colonists had these willow baskets and things they brought with them, and that these were important to them, and they knew they could work with brown ash, and it would work in a way that would meet the colonists' tastes. And so they started producing the baskets and selling them to the colonists, and I think that's the way to do it.
Were berries of blackberries that were used for dye?
So I used blackberries, and it doesn't have that, there's a word for it, color fastness, the sunlight, and still, that's what build my basket. I use it as my basket making basket, and they're kind of a steel gray at this point, you know. So I can't think of what that term is for being able to hold the color, but that was what Lorraine Carey was. So she studied under a fellow named Kennedy in Vermont. He was an incredible weaver and did the natural dyes. At any rate, so onion skins, yellow, those are the yellows. Red, you know, there's a cochineal bug that comes out of South America that does a beautiful red, but here, the closest I've found is, bloodroot. And so I do dye with some bloodroot, and I transplanted some to my gardens. And for blue, I think there's something that grows locally that will do a sort of blue, but I do use indigo. But that's the other thing is, like, what Bob Goodney's finding is we do a lot of trade, and the things they're finding, you know, and so the closer we got to this time, once the Vikings were bringing stuff over in their ships, this Bob wasn't a part of this, but there was a archaeological project done up in Huron country in Ottawa. Wasn't it, Bill? Ontario, just north of Ottawa, right? That Huron?
Montreal.
Oh, just north of Montreal, okay. Toronto, yeah, really big site they found, and they did some archaeology work, and they found this piece of metal, and somehow, you can't really carbon date metal, but somehow they were able to carbon date something that was beside it or something, and it was like 1500s. So it's like, how were Native Americans north of Toronto getting, and so they discounted it, which is what science does, right? Oh, there's nothing that we know that makes sense of this. But eventually, then they went to talk to the tribe, what an old idea. The Huron survivors, and then they did a lot more study, and they learned about the Vikings, and then the network of trade that was happening from the Maine coast, from the Gaspé area to Toronto. And so then it made sense why they would do this metal there. So I like to say they had indigo at some point. It made it through the trade routes at some point. So that's for blue. Hemlock bark, I do that a lot, or spruce root will do like a nice reddy brown color. Lichen, and I have no proof, but I would be shocked if they didn't discover this, but that big sheets of the gray lichen or lichen on rocks produces like a really bright, there's a word for it, chartreuse. No, it's not the green color. It's a purpley, pinky color. It's beautiful. And depending, and so it needs an ammonia. So the old way is urine, or the new way is ammonia, and let it soak for a really long time and shake it. So I haven't tried that one yet, but I have a little bit of this material in the bag. Dry that.
Once an ash borer gets into a tree, does that prevent it from being used for basket making?
It kills the tree. So when the tree starts to die, it dries out. So once the tree dries out, it's too brittle, you know.
And so Bill's been working trial and error with it. So we had a farmer who still had some leaves on them.
Right.
And they went and cut it down and started working with it. And it sort of functioned, right? At first you thought, well, okay, this is pounding off. It looks like if you get the outer layers off and you get to that thaw. But then it was so brittle. And his poor Prince Daryl was so struggling with it breaking and causing trouble, and then they realized, no, it's marginal.
It is, yeah.
So we're just learning what. Yes.
Can you split other trees the way you split the ash, or is you use ash because it splits that way?
I use ash because it splits it.
And then, I don't know if you answered this before, forgive me, but once it splits, can you then cut it into skinnier pieces, or you have to use it as is when it splits, like the sheet? Like, can you get skinnier pieces for weaving to change the thickness?
Yeah.
Do you mean thinner, or do you mean its depth or its width?
The width of it. So like I see in some of the baskets, it looks like there are much skinnier pieces that are woven together.
Yeah. She's talking about your gauges. You're gauging
Oh,
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you can make these things.
That's what that
Yes.
is. Okay, I apologize.
Yeah, so do you mind if I take this closer to folks?
But you can also.
So
you can
this
also
is
take it.
for 3/8. You
Okay.
see, so this is like,
Got it.
so here the blades are 3/8 of an inch apart, and then so if he wants, so he has others that are quarter, half.
Okay.
And so the width or the thickness, right? This dimension is the years. So that doesn't vary, or like that's set by
That makes
growth
sense.
of the tree.
You got it.
Okay.
But you can split that.
You can split it this way?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
So with the fancy baskets, if you notice that they're real shiny. And that is because they can. So if you just cut it a little bit,
Just do it part way and then I'll pass it around.
pass it around.
Like half of a
Yeah, could be a half. Sometimes you can split them 4 times. Sometimes half.
How long does that process take to split the reeds for basket weaving?
You wanna know why they're so expensive?
But really, like months, like how long before it's ready to be used?
Well, we're not very good at tracking our time, but when Luke was working with me, Jeannie was a perfectionist, and I tend to be a perfectionist. So there can't be any little hairs or anything on the wood. And then poor dude, 92 years old, I'd be like, he goes, "You're never gonna make a living at this deer." So you can spend a lot of time where you can get a basket and sell it is part of the answer, but it's very labor intensive, very, very labor, especially for the fancy baskets. And then not every piece you split is of the right quality, so there's that.
I don't know how mature a tree you have to have before you can get material you can use for making baskets.
Well, I like a tree that's around 8 inches across height. It's probably 70 years old. 8 inches. Black ash doesn't grow very big. It's not a very good quality wood. Lucky to get one good, clear 8 to 10 foot length out of it. It's not like white edge.
And Wolfboro, so in Warner, we're doing a class in September. And if you check with the Warner Public Market, you can sign up for that. We just rescheduled that from last weekend, I think. So I know it's not full yet. That'll be limited. There are many non-Abenaki basketmakers that teach basketmaking. A lot of them use reed. A few of them use black ash. With what's happening with the black ash, it's harder and harder to find anybody, but Linda and I are going to use black ash in this class we're doing. So Linda's colonial and I'm Abenaki, and we're teaming up. And it's a fundraiser for a new conservation project. It's a farm, a foster farm, where in Warner, where a nonprofit group has gotten together and formed a board, and we hope to bring in farmers and have older farmers there. And so we can do an apprenticeship thing for the farmers to live farming, and the land is on conservation, and people are actually doing gardens there, and farm to table stuff happening. So we'd love to teach you there. Other than that, I don't know a lot of basket classes happening.
You're working all with the Society for Protection of National Forests, and the Northern Forest Center.
Yeah, but I'm working with some different conservation groups so that we can get access to it, because I think of the probably thousands of ash trees that have died that nobody got to use. Kind of the you know. And I think if Avenatti people had a seat at the table, they would have known that people could have used them.
And so that's happening more and more, but Mike was very active in, or is very active in that group, and he is a private landowner who owns a different species that Bill uses, and he's been very cooperative. And then UNH is doing a big study for us right now on the Atlantic white cedar, and Mike's involved in that with us. So kind of one generation away, arms length away for the society. Yeah.
I'd like to share a few things. Some neighbors and I got together, we put 170 acres into conservation trust. And I think there's some ash trees, so I'll give you my card.
Nice.
The other thing, I was asked to be a consultant up in Waterville Valley, because some people wanted to simply make a recognition, verbal recognition that this was Abenaki territory. And there was somebody who was a really wrong-headed, he was so threatened that they squashed the whole thing. So I really praise the fact that you're going forward. I mean, this is just wonderful information. It's not just, it shouldn't be, political, but it was somehow terrorizing to these people who didn't want to even recognize the historic fact.
The times are here for us to also survive and to pay attention to our democracy and for people to stand up and pay attention.
So I want to thank you both for coming, for your time, for your knowledge. And our summer's programming wouldn't be possible without the support of the New Hampshire State Council on the Arts, which is funded through the National Endowment for the Community. So we're really grateful for that support, as well as the support of our members. So if you aren't already one, I would encourage you to consider joining the museum's membership program to help us put on more programming like this just future. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for having us.
Thank you.